Good afternoon, Laura. How are you?
I am well, Benyamin. How are you doing?
I am enjoying this National Puppy Day. I guess you can see it on the floor underneath the window. There is my
There's a few
90-pound
puppies.
dog, Jolene,
There's a few puppies roaming around the Cohen residence these
the Cohen
days.
compound. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's going on with you?
Oh, it's a gray, rainy
Yeah.
Rosh Chodesh Nissan here in the city. Tried to go on a lunchtime run around Central Park. It was pouring rain, so not
Yeah.
uplifting, but happy to be back inside.
Yeah.
So,
It's a torrential flooding downpour here too as well. So
super exciting.
I guess that means it's the first week of spring. So
Yeah,
maybe that's what it means. It's the change in weather.
there you go.
So I want to welcome everybody to our show. We've almost come up with the name of the show. I don't think we want to reveal it just yet, but just want
Yeah,
our fans
still
to know
top secret.
top secret for now. But when we do have it, we're gonna have swag and coffee mugs and sweatshirts and baseball
Oh,
hats and
yeah,
all that. Um,
absolutely.
but we're gonna, as usual, we're gonna discuss some news stories from the week during the first half of the show, and then the second half of the show, we are going to be joined by a really interesting guest, Amir Tibon. He is an Israeli journalist for Haaretz, which is an English language newspaper in Israel. It's also a Hebrew language newspaper, but it's a
Yes.
big newspaper in Israel. And we really wanted to have him on to just kind of help us, explain what's all the turmoil that's going on in Israel right now, and explain terms that we read about like judicial overhaul, and actually explain what that means.
Exactly. And Amir writes for both the English language and the Hebrew language Haaretz. He served in the Washington, D.C. bureau for a while. So he's an expert on both communities. And we've collected our own questions as well as some of your questions from Twitter. If you have additional ones as we're talking, we'll try to keep an eye on the comments and see as many as we can bring in. But
Yeah.
before we get to that, Benjamin, somehow George Soros and Trump and Alan Dershowitz back in the news
The
cycle.
trifecta.
The
Tell
trifecta.
us what the
So,
story is.
so as many people have seen, former President Donald Trump has been claiming for a while that he will be imminently arrested, which seems to have been good for fundraising for him. And it's also been good for Alan Dershowitz's media appearances. The Harvard law professor who counseled Trump during his first impeachment trial recently argued that Republicans who criticize George Soros, the billionaire Democratic donor, shouldn't be concerned about anti-Semitism. He went as far to say that Soros, the Holocaust survivor, is, quote, not much of a Jew. Yeah. It's always a fun thing to say. I didn't know they had religiosity tests at Auschwitz, but apparently. But he did say something reasonable amid his kind of shit stirring, if we can say that on our live podcast. But
it's too late now. It's a live podcast.
He said that Americans shouldn't be fearful of the charge of anti-Semitism when going after Soros, quote, on the merits. And I think this gets into a really important distinction, and I'd love to hear some of your thoughts as well. But this is a very significant Democratic donor. There are tons of reasons that Republicans and conservatives have to oppose the work of George Soros. But often we see the discourse online slip into lazy anti-Semitic stereotypes. For example, calling Soros a globalist or lumping him in with other Jewish figures that he may or may not have close relationships with. And we've published many articles on this over the years, but Soros has become kind of this figure for both mainstream conservatives to attack and, unfortunately, far-right anti-Semites to use as kind of this signal of Jewish dominance and nefariousness. So I think Dershowitz is right that there's really this fine line to tread. I think he went a little too far with his ad hominem attacks. But what do you think, Benjamin, watching this story unfold?
We see headlines several times a week, probably around here, where usually Republicans, usually far right Republicans, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene comes to mind, where or Republican lawmakers who are sending out fundraising emails, and they will invoke George Soros, evil George Soros, puppet master George Soros, is an evil person, and we need to raise money to stop him.
Right.
I've always been, yes, saying somebody, saying evil George Soros is not in itself inherently anti-Semitic. The question becomes, what was the meaning under the initial statement? Like, if you just scratch the surface a little bit,
Yeah.
A, and B, it also worries me that even if, Alan Dershowitz was saying, just saying George Soros, is a bad person is not anti-Semitic, that's fine for Alan Dershowitz perhaps to say, because Alan Dershowitz is Jewish and a smart person. But like, what happens to someone who is not as smart and who is not Jewish, who hears Alan Dershowitz on Newsmax or some news channel saying this statement, and then they take that information to the next level? Like, okay, George Soros, evil Jewish puppet master.
Right. It's also important to remember that the amount of online disinformation and conspiracy mongering, particularly around George Soros, is one of the loudest conspiracies in right-wing circles ever. And it's connected to a lot of other anti-Semitic stereotypes, like, for example, Jews are plotting to, marginalize certain communities, including white people, start race wars. The trope about Soros funding migrant caravans, that was some anti-Semitic misinformation that circled wildly in recent years. So I think it's very easy to slide from a normal criticism, like, Soros spends millions of dollars on causes that some people may not align with their beliefs. It's a very short line from that to sliding into like these anti-Semitic tropes that there's just so much.
Right.
There's like a whole operation online that funds this and feeds this anti-Semitism. So it is a little naive to speak about Soros as if that ecosystem didn't exist. So, I
Right.
mean,
Right.
Abe Foxman, the former ADL national director, um, longtime man of the Jewish people, said, I too disagree with what much of Soros supports, but since he's used as such a symbol of the anti-Semitic tropes around the international money Jew, his words, Dershowitz went a little too far. That was Foxman's read of it.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, demonizing people. I mean, in general, politics is a dirty business. We all know that.
Right.
But like, demonizing anybody, even people you disagree with, I think there's, demonizing can just lead to all sorts of things, bad things, as we've seen in the course of history when you demonize another person. I'm curious what you think, and then we'll get on to our next topic. But before we leave the Soros conversation, I'm curious what you think. George Soros is 92 years old, right? I mean, what's going to happen 5-10 years from now? When he passes away, is he still going to be the boogeyman? Is there still going to be people saying, well, the Soros Foundation, they'll just replace George Soros with the Soros Foundation is funding XYZ?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, Open Society is a big organization. It's not going to go away when Soros dies, even though he's given, more than 32 billion of his personal fortune to fund it. I think in the same way that when Sheldon Adelson passed away, it was his wife, but Miriam Adelson, the next closest person in the inner circle. And right-wing Jewish organizations certainly have no shortage of funding still. I think in the same way, Soros's institutions and legacy are going to continue. But it's, there's always someone to be vilified. And by the way, the center left and the far left, I would say, often vilify Sheldon Adelson, not in the same way. It's not this anti-Semitic conspiracy mongering, but anytime you have a massive figure who's spending massive amounts of money trying to influence things, you're going to try to fine line when you're talking about them.
Yeah. I mean, any wealthy Jewish person, then you start to wade into these kind of stereotypes.
Right. So, I mean, I feel like a good rule of thumb for folks in general is if you're talking about specific actions or policies that the person has done, that's a good way to avoid sliding into tropes. Like, talk about actions, talk about specifics, don't sloppily associate people just because they're both Jewish. Good way to avoid an anti-Semitic news storm.
I mean, I think the fact that, and then we can move on after. I think the fact that Soros is a Holocaust survivor is just kind of like adds a little extra, you know,
Totally.
I don't know, distastefulness, I guess, when he's criticized. Let's do one more. Let's do one more story before we bring in our guest, Israeli journalist Amir Tibon, to talk about Israel, which is obviously big news of the week. But there was it was a funny story I saw, and I wanted to get your take on it. So we linked to a story this week about a Jewish guy. He was a Texas, lives in Texas. He's an ad executive, business guy, and he quit his job to follow his dream, and he opened a restaurant, and he wanted the food that he served, to merge his Jewish heritage with his upbringing in El Paso. And so the name of the restaurant is Jew Boy Burgers. Jew Boy Burgers. And on the one hand, it's perfectly fine for a Jewish person to call something whatever he wants to call it, and it's not, I guess, is it offensive? It isn't offensive if a Jewish person is making, like, obviously if a non-Jewish person created a restaurant called Jew Boy Burgers, we would all be up in arms.
A little problem.
So A, why are we not all up in arms with this? And B, even though he is Jewish, is there possibility that, like, now you're going to have other people who are not Jewish, like, I'm going to Jew Boy Burgers, and maybe it becomes part of the lexicon?
It's definitely irreverent. I mean, anything where you're playing with your identity and playing with tradition is fraught. I remember I did a story several years ago for Hanukkah. There was a restaurant, I believe in New Orleans, that was serving all of these non-kosher combinations of latkes for Hanukkah. Really gourmet stuff. And people were so mad at these Jewish people.
Do you remember what any of them were?
I don't know. Some
you mean like shrimp bacon latkes, like
things like that. Like that. I mean, they were a non-kosher barbecue joint run by Reform Jews, and they decided, let's serve latkes along with the other tray food we have. We're gonna light menorahs, and I remember speaking to them, and they were just so flabbergasted that other people cared so much about, like, the way they were choosing to practice their culinary traditions. And I kind of feel like this is a similar thing. I mean, first of all, have you ever been called Jew boy? Is that even like an insult anymore?
I might have been as a kid. I don't know.
That was a while ago.
In the South.
Exactly. I don't know. It seems, I mean, I'm a very irreverent person in general, but it's kind of fun. I don't know.
But I think there might be a connection to the previous story we were talking about. Like, Alan Dershowitz, criticizing George Soros versus, a white supremacist criticizing George Soros. And this similar, I mean, not to take it to that extreme, but like, how would you feel if a white supremacist said, I'm going to Jew Boy Burgers for lunch?
Yeah.
Or it's okay for me to use the term Jew Boy Burgers because
if they're patronizing Jew Boy Burgers, funneling money back into the, local Jewish community, great, wonderful. If they want to patronize a Jewish restaurant, more power. We should ask Alan Dershowitz, really, what he thinks of Jew Boy Burgers.
Is this in any way, do you think, taking back the term, there was I don't know if you remember this, like 15 years ago, maybe, there was a Jewish magazine, a Reverend Jewish magazine that came out. It was called Heeb, Heeb.
Yeah.
And, and people were like, what? You can't do that. And it was like, no, we're trying to take back that term.
Yeah.
But the magazine's not around anymore.
Well, I'd never used or really heard that term much before. Yeah. Our colleagues, Robin Washington, who is Black, and Rob Eshman, who is white, both Jewish, recently wrote a piece about how the Black community has reclaimed the N-word and the Jewish community has not reclaimed some of the slurs traditionally used against us. It was a very interesting conversation. I think folks should take a look, but a lot of this just kind of evolves organically within a community. And I don't know, of all the things, maybe if he had called it like the K-word burgers, I might have stronger feelings about it.
Right.
But,
right.
It's like a few years ago, people were calling themselves Jewesses, which also used to be kind of seen flippantly as an insult. And I don't know, it's playing with reclaiming your own identity. We'll see. Yeah. If you have strong feelings, let us know in the comments.
Yeah. Okay, so we wanted to bring in our guest, Amir Tibon. He's an Israeli journalist, writes for Haaretz. And anyone who's been following our website and our morning newsletter, we've talked a lot about in the last month or so about something called a judicial overhaul going on in Israel, and Amir hopefully will explain what that is for us. But basically, there's been protests for I think 12 weeks now, massive protests. Today was a day of paralysis, they called it, and 500,000 people were expected to be out in protest. Some people are protesting here in America about the Israeli government, and we've seen stories how IDF reservists don't want to report to duty. So we really wanted to bring Amir on to kind of help wrap our head around exactly what's going on there. So welcome, Amir.
Hi guys, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks for staying up late.
Yeah.
I'll tell you something. I'm going to stay up very late today because we are waiting for Prime Minister Netanyahu to speak in about 30 minutes. Oh. He's supposed to give a statement and nobody knows what he's planning to say. But we do know that earlier this evening, see, I'm really breaking news here with you guys. We do know that earlier this evening, here in Israel, it's already 8 p.m. here. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who is himself from the Likud party, approached Prime Minister Netanyahu and said, "I'm asking you to stop this legislation immediately. The legislation to weaken the judicial system and give the government control over judicial appointments." Defense Minister Gallant says to Prime Minister Netanyahu, "Please stop, because this is tearing apart the military. And if it continues and becomes law in a week or two, that's the deadline, because the Knesset is going on Passover break pretty soon. Defense Minister believes that this will cause a serious crisis within the military that will actually hurt its capability to carry out security missions." And how will Netanyahu respond to that? We don't know. We'll have to see in about 20 to 30 minutes when he speaks, but we're going to have a long night here in Israel. And of course, for me and my colleagues at Haaretz, there's going to be a lot of action.
Yeah, definitely. So taking a step back from this micro moment that we're seeing, I wonder if you could walk us through, I know there's a lot, but very briefly, explain to us, like we're 5 years old, why are people out in the streets? Why is everyone protesting? What are the larger issues at play here beyond this specific proposed legislation change?
Yeah, 5-year-olds is good because, today I tried to explain to my 3-year-old, because there was a demonstration that was organized here in the small kibbutz where I live. So, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a challenge to explain. Basically, this new government that Benjamin Netanyahu is leading since the beginning of the year, that's when they took office, came right out of the gate with a very dramatic plan to remake the balance of power between the different authorities in Israel, weakening the judicial branch of government and giving a lot more power to the government. This plan, they call it a reform, others call it a judicial overhaul or even a coup, but at the basis of it are several laws that are supposed to be just legislative package, that when you look at them combined, and we can go into each and every one if you want the exact details, but when you look at them combined, what they will create is a reality where there will no longer be judicial review in Israel. One law gives the government the power to appoint judges basically on its own terms. Today in Israel, judicial appointments are made in a committee where there is equal representation for politicians, sitting judges, and the lawyers bar. That committee is far from perfect. There has been a lot of criticism of it, and I actually think there is a place for reform and change. But what the government wants to do is to change the makeup of the committee, basically giving itself an automatic majority and full control of all appointments. This is a bit like the White House appointing justices in America without having to go through the Senate whenever the Senate is controlled by the opposition party, which happens sometimes in your country. So that's one example. The other component is the override clause. On top of choosing the judges and the justices of the Supreme Court, they want the smallest possible majority in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, to have the power to override Supreme Court decisions and basically nullify them. And another third component I want to mention, they want to dramatically raise the bar of what will be required for the Supreme Court to strike down legislation and governmental decisions in the first place. They want it to be 80% of the sitting justices. So in the American example, this would mean that in order for the Supreme Court to strike down the laws, it would need to be 7 of your 9 justices. Here they want to do it 12 out of 15. So think about it. The justices are chosen by the government. 80% of them need to agree in order to strike down legislation that, let's say, discriminates against women or LGBT or other minorities. And even after that, if you reach this unicorn scenario where 80% of the justices agree, still the smallest possible majority can override. And this is why so many people are protesting, because there is a sense that this would completely change Israel from the liberal democracy flawless it is that we have today to a different kind of country.
So is this like, I mean, what you're saying, of what I'm hearing, is that you would lose some of the checks and balances like we have here in America, 3 branches of government. It would basically be neutering the Supreme Court and saying their rules don't apply anymore and we can override what they're saying.
The issue in Israel really is that we don't have 3 authorities. On paper we do, but in practice we have 2, because the government and the Knesset are almost in lockstep, since we have a parliamentary system where the government has the majority in the Knesset, or you can look at the other way around. The majority in the Knesset holds the government. It doesn't really matter, but they are operating together. The government always has a majority in the Knesset. If it loses that majority, it falls apart. This is what happened to the Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid government last year. They lost the majority, and with it, they lost the government. The only real power that can balance the government and play some role of restricting and restraining it is the Supreme Court. Now, there is valid criticism from the Israeli right wing and also some people in the center left bloc that the Supreme Court perhaps sometimes has gone too far, and that the whole issue of judicial review is not clearly defined by legislation in Israel. We don't have a constitution in this country, and we don't have a basic law that dictates what will be the exact responsibilities of the Supreme Court vis-a-vis legislation of the Knesset. So there definitely is place for some changes and some reforms, but what this government is proposing is extreme. And that's why you're seeing even people who over the years have themselves called for judicial reform, for changes in the balance between the Supreme Court and the Knesset, joining the protests. There are experts in Israel who for 20-something years have been speaking about the need to restrain the Supreme Court. And now when the government is actually trying to do it, they are joining the protests because they're saying the government is just taking this way, way too far.
So a lot of the narrative that we've been hearing here is obviously Netanyahu is embroiled in several corruption scandals. And there's been a lot of talk that this is all kind of just a ploy of Netanyahu's to skirt out of accountability for all of those corruption trials. But there also seems to be a very significant push from the right wing of his coalition that is about something deeper. So how much of this is about Netanyahu's personal problems, and how much of this is deeper seated issues that have been broiling for a while?
Yeah, Laura, this is the million-dollar question also for the events we're going to have tonight when he's going to speak. If you go back 10 or even 5 years ago, before Benjamin Netanyahu became a suspect and then a criminal defendant, you will find many speeches and statements and interviews in which Benjamin Netanyahu proudly defended and praised the Supreme Court of Israel and spoke about the importance of an independent Supreme Court and a strong judicial system. And initiatives from the Israeli religious right to weaken the Supreme Court have been around for decades. So he was actually the one blocking it, and he took pride in it. He said, there are initiatives from my own party or from the religious parties that I'm aligned with to weaken the Supreme Court, and I shoot them down one by one. For the religious parties that are governed with Netanyahu in this coalition, weakening the Supreme Court is a dream of decades because they see the Supreme Court as a liberalizing force in Israeli society, and rightly so. A lot of the progress that we've had in Israel over the last decades and that we are so proud of in areas like LGBT rights, women's rights, equality for minorities, actually happened through decisions of the Supreme Court, not through legislation in the Knesset. The Supreme Court interpreted the basic laws of the State of Israel, which are a temporary and flawed replacement for a constitution, but it interpreted them in ways that enlarged civil and human rights in Israel. And for the religious parties that want less equality for women and less equality for LGBT Israelis and more religious coercion and religious legislation in the public sphere, this has been a problem. And they've been wanting to weaken the Supreme Court for a long time. But Netanyahu did not go along with them. He kept blocking these initiatives because he was loyal to the original description of the Likud party as the National Liberal Party of Israel. And so what has changed? Why is the man who blocked all these initiatives for many years suddenly supporting and leading them? Sadly, it's hard to avoid the thought that perhaps this is because of his own legal turmoil. And just when we talk about the idea of the government appointing Supreme Court justices, remember that no matter what happens in Netanyahu's trial before the Jerusalem District Court, which is still happening right now, there is going to be an appeal to the Supreme Court. So basically, they want to draw a situation where he can be involved in choosing the justices that will hear his own case. And even in the new and supposedly softened version of the legislation that was proposed last week, they will have the power to appoint at least the next 2 Supreme Court justices, including the next Chief Justice. And the Chief Justice has the ability to choose the justices that will sit and hear specific cases. So this is really giving Netanyahu the power to influence who will be the justices that will hear the appeal in his own trial when it gets to the Supreme Court, maybe 2 or 3 years from now. That's a very problematic situation, to say the least.
Couldn't the next prime minister just put new judges?
Well, first of all, it's true that if you want to politicize the judicial system, today it would serve the right-wing religious government, tomorrow it could serve another government. And what you would have here in Israel is a scenario where justices are seen a bit like you guys have in America as political actors, which I don't know if that's been working so great for you guys. You know, when this all started about 2 months ago, I interviewed Ellen Dershowitz on the Haaretz podcast.
We were just talking about it.
I heard. And Dershowitz spoke about his opposition to this judicial part. He also said that he doesn't agree with some of the writing that appeared also in Haaretz, that if this passes, Israel will no longer be a democracy. But he said he's strongly opposed to these measures. And specifically on the issue of judicial appointments, he said, why would Israel want to copy from the United States the one thing that is so terrible in our current political constitutional system, which is the complete politicization of the Supreme Court and the view of justices as political actors? He said, please don't do it. It's been a disaster for the United States. Although I will add that even this disaster, as Dershowitz calls it, is better than what the government wants to do here, because at least in your system, the entire Senate has to vote on every judicial appointment. And that matters because sometimes when you have an evenly divided Senate or a small margin like you have today, it only takes 1 or 2 rebels from the party with the majority to vote against an unqualified or inappropriate nominee. In our system with the committee, what you're going to have is a majority for the government in the committee, and the government is not going to put as its representatives on the committee the Mitt Romneys and Susan Collinses of the Likud. They're going to put the Marjorie Taylor Greens on that committee, the extremist populists who will do whatever Netanyahu tells them. And if it's the other government, it will be the same. And I think this will lead to terrible appointments, even from a non-political point of view.
Yeah.
So there's, as usually happens when there's a flare-up in Israel, there's been a lot of hand-wringing in the U.S. Jewish community. UJA sent a major delegation either last week or a couple weeks ago to try to rally against the judicial reform / overhaul. Do you think that American attempts at intervention are helping or hurting the chances of an outcome that's beneficial for the country?
I don't think it has much of an influence either way right now. I think it is one of many vectors and pressure points that are operating and that Netanyahu is watching. So there is the issue of the United States, which includes President Biden, who has come out strongly against this, and he spoke on the phone with the Prime Minister earlier this week and basically gave him a civics class. And we're hearing senators and members of Congress warning Netanyahu that this would change the way Israel is viewed in Washington. Because today Israel is viewed as a close American ally that shares America's liberal democratic values. And tomorrow that might not be the case anymore. And we're not hearing this from people who are often critical of the Israeli government. The opposite, we're hearing it from members of Congress who are Israel's strongest supporters, at least on the democratic side. And yes, the Jewish community as well is speaking out, and we're hearing more and more people in the community criticize this. I think, frankly, that the Jewish establishment organizations are way behind. I mean, they don't understand what's happening in their own community, if you ask me from my interpretation. I was in the US a few weeks ago. We had a conference that Haaretz organized with UCLA, and I meet all the time delegations and groups that come here to Israel. And I heard people speaking in such emotional and sometimes even extreme terms about what is happening right now. And then you hear the statements of the legacy organizations, which is kind of like this old classic, like, we love Israel so much.
Yeah.
We really hope there can be compromise. It's for the best interests of everyone. And they're just like, they're behind a bit. But still, there is an understanding that something is changing in the Jewish community. I mean, we've done a lot of reporting about it in Haaretz. You guys are writing about it at the Forward, and Netanyahu has people that read and report and bring this to his desk. And then there are other pressure points as well. We spoke earlier about the military and the option of disintegration of Israel's reserve forces, which is a huge problem. The economic situation here is also something that's, I think, a very high risk associated with this plan. It's amazing. Today in the afternoon, when the first reports came out that Defense Minister Gallant was going to speak out against the plan, something incredible happened at the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. After a day of like this, very, very little movements and going a little down, suddenly the main indexes went way up and closed with like 2 or 3% rising, just because of a first initial leak about a potential statement by the defense minister against the judicial plan. And the shekel, which has been losing value against the dollar ever since this event began, once the message came out about the defense minister, it immediately went up and the dollar went down. I mean, you really see that the markets want this to go away. So all of these pressures combined are in front of Netanyahu, but he's also facing a different set of pressures coming from within his own party, where there are very extreme people who are committed to this plan, and his coalition, again, some very extreme people there who have been dreaming for a long time about weakening the Supreme Court, and also inside his house, his own son, who is a political personality today. I mean, I don't like to talk about politicians' families. I don't think we need to have a lot of that discussion. But Yair Netanyahu is not the son of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Right.
He is himself a political actor within Likud, a very powerful one. And he's been pushing very hard to do this against the advice of all the experts and against the warnings of all the security chiefs and the governor of the Bank of Israel and, the senators and so forth. So definitely, Netanyahu is facing pressures from two different directions. I don't know what he will eventually choose.
It's worth noting also that American Jews are not universally against the reforms. Your colleague wrote a big scoop in January, I believe, about the American billionaires funding the Kohelet Foundation, a right-wing group that has set up a lot of these reforms. So there's a nuanced thing happening on both sides.
Yeah, it's true that there's also involvement from the right wing that's supportive of this. And by the way, there has been a lot of criticism of Kohelet. I look at it and I also ask maybe for liberal segments of the American Jewish community, there is also a lesson to learn here from this very successful initiative that has changed politics in Israel.
Yeah. President Herzog, I'm curious to hear your take on this. A week or two ago, who said there's a chance of civil war. Was that hyperbole, or do you think there's like a reality of something?
I think he believes it. I think he believes it. And I have to tell you that I've been seeing myself a lot of disturbing things in the streets covering these protests. Today, there was I live in the Gaza border area of Israel. An hour and a little bit south of Tel Aviv. It's a different country. And there was today this demonstration of residents of the Gaza border area who did this like convoy of cars with Israeli flags to protest the judicial plan. And the people who are supportive of the plan and of Prime Minister Netanyahu are stopping their cars and saying, "I hope rockets fall on your houses. I hope Hamas kills your children." Very, very extreme language. When people tell you something like that, that shows where the discussion is headed. It's not heading in a good direction right now. There is, I think, a sense of great tension in the air. And I think Herzog really wanted his plan to be the diffuser and to begin a process of calming down the situation. So far, I don't see it happening. I think with every passing day, the tension is rising. Now, there are also good examples. I have to say that today, there was a protest in Bnei Brak, which is a major ultra-Orthodox city, and people people were protesting there, and the police managed to separate, and there were, from until now at least, no violent incidents. I hope it stays that way because the process is still ongoing. And actually, there was a really beautiful initiative of people in Bnei Brak to welcome the demonstrators, who are mostly secular Israelis from other parts of the country, and they came to demonstrate in Bnei Brak because their ultra-Orthodox leadership is very supportive of the judicial plan. But the residents, they're organized to welcome the protesters with the food and water and invite them for dialogue. So there are also things like this, and I don't want to paint a picture that is only grim, but the energy that exists out there that is negative and violent is growing, and it's a very, very dangerous situation.
Well, you had a kernel of hope there, so maybe we could end.
Yeah, I added one sentence too much, guys.
We can cut that out. It's a live broadcast. Listen, Amir, really, we appreciate you taking the time. I put a link for anyone who's interested in the comments. I put a link to Amir's articles at Haaretz, and I guess we should be checking it in a few minutes to see what.
There's gonna be drama tonight, guys. Thank you for having me. I gotta run now to do some news. Good luck with everything, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks so much. Take care. Wow. So I feel like I know more, but now I'm worried more.
I was gonna say, are you encouraged or deflated by that conversation? I feel like I'm kind of some combo of both, which might just mean that I'm bloated. So I don't know. It's a confusing time, and it's evolving in real time. We'll all tune in to see what Amir reports later today. But back to our regular lineup of things. We got a Nudnik and Sadik this week.
Like to close things out with a kind of a win and a fail. So we'll do our fail, our Nudnik, since we're leaning into our Yiddish heritage. So we'll do our Nudnik of the week. You wanna do that one?
Yeah, this one I feel like can always be a Nudnik of all time. White supremacists. The Anti-Defamation League came out with a report this morning that showed that extremist attacks from white supremacists, showed that white supremacist propaganda skyrocketed in 2022. We know that most extremist violence is linked to the far right. So white supremacists still doing their dangerous things. That's our Nudnik of the week.
I am going to put in the comments the link to the story you just mentioned. about the ADL report that came out this morning. And so for the tzaddik of the week, I am going to nominate. We're all familiar with the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh. In 2018, it was the site of the most deadliest anti-Semitic attack in history. And so the building has been closed for about 4.5 years now. And they've had a couple random events there, some memorial events there, but they don't host services there at all. And so they're getting ready to tear down part of the building. They're gonna rebuild this huge 45,000 square foot complex. It's going to house the synagogue. It's going to house an anti-Semitism center. It's going to house, I think, the Holocaust Museum of Pittsburgh. So before they start doing the construction, Tree of Life sent out, I think it was like a Facebook message to their congregants, and they said, listen, on Sunday, this past Sunday, we're going to open the doors for about 90 minutes. We have all this stuff inside, yard site plaques, art on the wall, your tallis bags, all these things that have been stuck inside the building come inside. And so it was a success. It was just a lot of people. I put the link. It was some beautiful pictures, courtesy of our friends at the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle. Beautiful pictures of people going inside. Just the whole social hall was full of folding tables, and people were taking the yard site plaques of their grandparents and preserving those so that they don't get lost during the construction. So I encourage everyone to take a look at those pictures. I put the link there. But that is our tzaddik of the week is the congregants of Tree of Life Synagogue.
It's just so moving. So the reporter that wrote that story for the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle, Adam, is a good friend. And I've just been so moved at every step of the process. We wrote a lot right after the horrific shooting about the care with which the synagogue was cleaned to make sure that it had utmost respect for human life and Jewish values, and the way that just every member of the community has been so supportive of each other, from, documenting what happened and the stories of those killed and survivors. And Adam's reporting has been really, really instrumental to documenting all of that. So I encourage all of you to follow Adam Reinhurst's reporting at the Pittsburgh Jewish Chronicle as well, and read the archival coverage.
Yeah, great reporting by Adam. All right, I think we'll wrap up now so we can get back to our day jobs.
Yeah, we got to see what Netanyahu has to say, and then read what Amir has to say about that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Happy National Puppy Day. Jolene has slept through this entire episode.
Amazing. She's enjoying her holiday. It's good.
Yeah.
It's good.
All right. Take care. We'll see you later.
Bye, Benjamin.
Bye.